Joining us now is the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, Roseanne Archibald. She was among the leaders who appeared before committee. Chief Archibald, thank you for joining us. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Michael.
Now, there's a lot to talk about here, but I do want to begin with the very idea of a National Council for Reconciliation. Talk to us about what this is and what this effort is meant to address.
This is a recommendation that came out of, or it's one of there's 3 calls to action in this National Council, and that came out of the TRC report, which is very survivor-driven. And so this comes from survivors as a recommendation, as a call to action to the government. And as the Assembly of First Nations, we had this discussion last November. I don't know if you remember the whole flag scenario of when the flags would go up and when they would go down. But as an AFN executive, the regional chiefs and I said, you know, one of the things that we need to have happen, a couple of things. One is to place the orange flag somewhere. We wanted it placed on the Peace Tower. We found out that that protocol wasn't possible. And the other thing that we recommended through a motion that we passed was the establishment of this National Council on Reconciliation. So the AFN is absolutely in support of these calls to action that will create the National Council for Reconciliation, and we certainly feel that our call back in November was a concerted effort by ourselves and others to get this council established. So getting the calls to action, getting some momentum on them, and to your point, this is calls to action 53 to 56 that this council would actually address. Now, it includes multi-year funding for a council. What do you think of that? Is multi-year sufficient? You know, during my presentation yesterday, I actually said that if reconciliation were a book, let's call it a 12-chapter book. We are in the first chapter, but we're really only on the first sentence of that book of reconciliation. It's a long road. We're talking about over 500 years of colonization. We're talking about hundreds of years of impact around the safety of our children and our women since the beginning of contact. So there's a big, long impact that's happened to First Nations. It's been very damaging to our communities. And so as a result, we really need to think about this long road ahead of us. We need to, the priority and the thing that we must get done as soon as possible are the 94 calls to action. That would be the end of the first sentence. And then there's ongoing work on reconciliation. It's about a relationship. We're trying to reconcile the truth of this country. We're trying to reconcile our relationship with government. We're trying to reconcile our relationships with just non-Indigenous Canadians who have benefited greatly from access to our lands and resources and waters, have built untold wealth on the backs of First Nations people. And so that road to reconciliation is a long one. We have to begin to really talk about economic reconciliation so that our First Nations can move beyond poverty and move into prosperity and have that abundance that the Creator gave us when we were placed here on Turtle Island. So it's a bigger question for me. It's a bigger process. And getting these calls to action done is a part of the council's work to monitor to that, to do an annual kind of assessment of where governments and groups are at in terms of those 94 calls. And it really falls on the federal government for certain to be the main player in those 94 TRC calls to action.
Main player, and when it comes to this National Council, it would seem that multi-year is insufficient. It would seem that what you're looking for, based on the description here, is a far more permanent funding model for this council to do its work.
Yeah, sorry, I went down a rabbit hole there.
It's
Michael.
perfectly fine.
But yeah, definitely. We do need long-term funding for the council, and we need long-term funding for reconciliation. And one of the things I've been talking about since I've been elected is to establish a healing fund, a national healing fund. Every time these former institutions of assimilation and genocide are investigated, that triggers every survivor that went to that particular institute, and also survivors across Canada. And it triggers intergenerational trauma survivors. It triggers non-Indigenous Canadians as well. And so we really need to look at what is the national healing path forward. And we need to have that funded, for example. And that's not necessarily in the TRC calls to action specifically that we establish a national healing fund, but to me, it's very obvious that we need one. And long-term funding to this issue is absolutely essential to us walking that healing path forward here on Turtle Island, or what we now call Canada.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you mentioned the testimony that you gave yesterday, it was also interesting because beyond raising the issue of funding and what you said that you already addressed with the committee, another issue that was raised by you had to do with the makeup of the council and how members of this council would be chosen. Talk to us about your concerns right now as to the current proposal if the amendments that you're referencing are not made.
I brought this up with Minister Miller in a phone call before we presented to the committee, and indicated to him that the majority of children who were taken from their homes and their communities were First Nations children. And First Nations have such a wide and deep impact because of these institutions. The Métis also have an impact, and so do the Inuit. Everybody does. And so when we wanted to make a recommendation on the makeup of the council itself, we recommended 3 be appointed by the AFN, 2 by the Métis, and 2 by the Inuit. That makes the majority of the board, and then we would work with the federal government to appoint the remaining members of that council. So that was our recommendation. It's very concise and clear, and whether those amendments are incorporated, we don't know. We want them there. Whether the government acts on them or not is unclear to me.
Yeah, it was interesting because you said if the amendments are not adopted, it reeks too much of colonialism.
It certainly does, and that was my when I did talk to Minister Miller, I said, you can't drive this process as the government and as the minister. That's very paternalistic. You're falling backward into the old colonial system where, the government feels that it knows better of what First Nations and Indigenous people need. And so that was my comment during the committee, is that we have to move forward, not back into paternalism, but move forward in true partnership. And true partnership means that the perspectives of First Nations, particularly around these institutes, are taken into account in the makeup of the new board, as it were. But again, wanting to support the Métis and Inuit as well in appointing representatives.
Are you hopeful at this point, and we're quickly running out of time, but I do have to ask, are you hopeful at this point that your concerns will be listened to and that a council will be created quickly?
I do have to tell you something about Mark Miller. I've always had a really positive relationship with him, and I met him long before he was the minister, and I just have such a sense of, I guess it is hope that he has heard us and that those changes will be made, but we won't know until the final reading and the final amendments are made.
Chief Roseanne Archibald, thank you for this. Always good to speak with you. Really appreciate the time.
Thank you, Michael. Take care.
You too. Take care.